Have you ever wondered what some people are talking about when they say, we're not African? We were already here. We're native to America. We're aboriginals. I'm sure you've heard that a few times and maybe even seen a few videos. Now, they're not talking about having a grandmother that is Native American Indian or simply having a little Native American blood in them. No, it's a little more complicated than that. They believe that since they can't trace their family line back to Africa, but instead, they can trace their family back to a particular Native American tribe, and they have paperwork which says their family are from that particular tribe. Then this partly proves that they are not African, but Native Americans or Aboriginal Americans. They believe that their ancestors were never in Africa and they were never put on a slave ship. Within their theory, they use the argument that black people inhabited the globe before anyone else. They claim that black people were on the megacontinent Pangaea before it split, therefore ending up in the Americas first. That argument is easily debunked, seeing as Pangaea split apart 200 million years ago. And if you believe in Pangaea, then you'll also be aware that no hominid species existed 200 million years ago. So it would be a complete impossibility to claim some species of humans, or even humans themselves, were on Pangaea while it split. Another argument used is that the oldest skull found in Brazil was of a black woman named Lucia, aged over 2 million years old. However, the skull of Lucia was indeed found in Brazil. She was indeed not of the Mongoloid race, but the skull is only 11,000 years old and has been traced back to a group of people found in Australia, the Aboriginal Australians. We also have the Ivan van Sertima argument, which is that there were indeed African people trading in the Americas before Columbus, hence the title of his book, They Came Before Columbus. Or the argument that the slave trade was a hoax and that we were already here, based on the misunderstanding that there was only a couple 100,000 enslaved Africans sent to the United States, rather than 13 million African people. However, this is a confusion of the facts. Records do indeed show that maybe around 600 or so thousand of enslaved Africans were sent directly to the United States, while the remainder of the 13 million were sent to the rest of the Americas, North and South. This is documented by the figures that only 5% were sent to the United States, while the other 95% were sent to the rest of the Americas, and then trading between countries and islands afterwards, which would then be documented as intercontinental trade. These are just a few of the theories, and I'm paraphrasing very quickly, but I do have much more in-depth videos about all of these topics, which will break it all down. And I even have a video that addresses how Africa got its name and what the real name of Africa is. The links to these videos will be in the description, so don't forget to check them all out. But don't go anywhere yet. Let's address why some people who are black are born and raised on reservations. Why they can show you paperwork and documentation for their membership of a particular tribe. There is a certain group of people out there that are charging black people money to show them how to trace their genealogy and their family line back to Native American tribes. And they're making a lot of money from doing this. These people also have these people believing that they are not African. Remember, I said I'm not talking about a grandmother or father that looks like your run-of-the-mill Native American. Yes, there are some black people that have Native American blood. I'm talking about someone that looks undeniably black, but yet says they are aboriginal to this country and land, and their people were already here. So in order to address that, we have to go back in time a little. There are black people that have enrollment papers and documentation that states they are part of a Native American tribe. They are indeed black people that were born on Indian reservations. So when you say to them, you're African, your ancestors were enslaved Africans, they find it very difficult to accept that information, simply because they have paperwork that says they're Native American or they were born on a particular reservation. They will argue that some black Native Americans were confused and reclassified as African Negroes and in turn enslaved. But all of this is confusion and misunderstanding. Many enslaved Africans that escaped from their white slave masters ran to and sought refuge within Native American tribes. This, of course, meant that they were able to live amongst the tribes, raise families, as well as marry into the tribes. They were also granted membership or enrollment of a tribe. This meaning that they were not indigenous to these tribes, but given membership and honorary status. The offspring of these runaway slaves born on the reservations would automatically be classified as tribe members. Would this change that these enrolled tribe members were African? Would this make them indigenous to America? No. It's the same as an American moving to the United Kingdom and applying for citizenship. They can have a British passport. They can now be a British national based on naturalization. Will that make them indigenous to the United Kingdom? No. If they then have children and those children are born in the United Kingdom, those children will of course be British, but their ancestors will not be British. They are merely British-born Americans. And those children will have all the paperwork that says they are British and their parents are British. You see where I'm going with this? A lot of these people that make videos on this topic will cherry pick information to fit their narrative and say, you see, it proves what I'm saying right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear this up. In the 1920s, Columbia University anthropologist Melville J. Herskovits, renowned for documentation of African survivals in American life, conducted interviews in New York, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C., which determined that 1/4 to 1/3 of African Americans had Indian ancestors. In 1622, the colony of Jamestown, Virginia, was attacked by Native Americans. However, all of the Africans were spared. In 1763, during Pontiac's Indian Uprising, a Detroit resident reported that Native Americans killed all the whites, but was sparing all the black people. Mohawks in New York welcomed runaway slaves and encouraged intermarriage. Native American adoption system accepted the breathless fugitives as brothers and sisters. Indian villages welcomed fugitives and served as stations on the Underground Railroad. After all, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Louisiana Governor Etienne de Perrier, whose African slaves escaped and united with the Natchez Indians, and in one raid destroyed a French colony and left 200 whites dead, warned this union between the Indian nations and the African slaves could lead to total loss for European colonies. To prevent this red and black alliance and instead make Native American villages allies with Europeans, British merchants introduced Africans as slaves to the 5 nations: the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, and Seminoles. This introduction of slavery created a negative hierarchy based on white blood. Indians of mixed white blood stood at the top, pure Indians were next, and Indians mixed with African blood were at the bottom. In 1860, Indian populations figures over a 30-year period showed a decline ranging from 20% to 40%, but the numbers of slaves owned by the Cherokees, Choctaws, Creeks, and Chickasaws had increased exponentially. The Indian population had decreased, but the ownership of slaves had increased. Slavery had become a major economic factor in each nation. However, this did not stop intermarriage and enrollment of Africans as tribe members. Thomas Jefferson discovered among the Mattapones of Virginia more Negro than Indian blood. The most militant expression of the Black-Indian alliance took place in Florida. Enslaved Africans fled bondage in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Carolinas to make a new life on the peninsula, which at that time was owned by Spain. Around the time of the American Revolution, Africans welcomed the Seminoles, a breakaway segment of the Creek Nation, to the peninsula, and taught them rice cultivation methods they had learned in Sierra Leone and Senegambia. On this basis, the two peoples formed an agricultural and military alliance that defeated repeated invasions by U.S. slaveholding posses. Finally, in 1819, to end a perceived threat by U.S. slaveholders, the United States purchased Florida. In Florida, the Red and Black Seminoles fought the United States Army, Navy, and Marines to a standstill for 4 decades. In 3 Seminole Wars, the United States Armed Forces lost more than 1,500 U.S. soldiers, spent more than $40 million, and at times, Seminole Armed Forces tied up half of the U.S. Army on the peninsula. By 1860, African Americans had so thoroughly mixed with Native Americans throughout the Atlantic seaboard that white legislators wanted to revoke their tax exemptions. They stated that if you were mixed with African, then you would not receive any of these benefits. In the Oklahoma Indian Territory, 18% of the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Seminoles, and Creeks were of African descent. Surrounded by Confederate troops and influenced by Confederate Indian agents, most Native Americans in Oklahoma felt they had little choice but to follow the Confederacy. However, in November 1861, hundreds of Black and Red Indians led by Creek Chief Apatoli Yahola fought 3 pitched battles against Confederate whites and Indians to reach Union lines in Kansas and offer their services. With the defeat of the Confederacy and its Indian allies, Northerners sought revenge, and the U.S. scrapped existing treaties with all the Native American nations. The Seminole Nation made the most rapid adjustment to emancipation, electing 6 Black members to its first post-war governing council. Seminoles of African descent began to build homes, churches, schools, and businesses. Cherokees and Creeks moved toward equality somewhat slower, and Choctaws and Chickasaws slower yet. Many people of African descent found escape, and some located their American dream among Native Americans. So these Black Indians are in fact Native American tribe members of African descent. So as you can see, this is the reason some Black people are members of Native American tribes. This is also the reason some Black people can trace their lineage back to these tribes. But these Black Indians were runaway African slaves who were adopted into the tribes.
Through my mother, I'm Seminole and African. Through my father, African, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Shawnee. And I spent part of my boyhood in Florida. You know, we're talking what I call post-invasion. Well, I look at October 12, 1492 as the jump-off point because we're talking about an event that would trigger a massive escalation of the transatlantic slave trade and the invasion of the hemisphere. So after that particular point in time, you know, the 2 groups of people came together under crisis conditions throughout the hemisphere. I mean, we can talk about instances of unity as well as instances of divide and conquer. I don't know if we can say 50-50, but it still goes on today. Goodness, we see this happening in places like among some communities like the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and even the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, where there's been turmoil about trying to sometime evict, yes, and please quote me, evict some members of the tribe from the tribal roles. Those have tended to be what they call freedmen, which tend to be those largely of African descent.
If you understand the history of African American and Native American peoples in this country, we had some things in common. Once the communication barrier was taken care of, then Native people and African peoples realized that there was so much in common culturally. For instance, the drum. The drum is the heartbeat of the nation.
It became quite a thing to flee into Florida by the hundreds, and it was quite productive. They could raise crops right next to the Indians. They married Indians. They became a part of the frontier. They raised their families. They raised their grandchildren, and they died right here in Florida.
So what about the paperwork? Researcher Angela Walton Raji explains that her family are African Native Americans. Her great-grandmother, Sally Walton, was born in Indian Territory in the Choctaw Nation. Angela Walton Raji had in her possession some family papers and a small land allotment record from her great-grandmother that she had obtained from the Dawes Commission. When she moved to the Washington, D.C. area and had access to the National Archives, she started to research her family records. Upon researching, she found a Choctaw Nation enrollment card for Samuel and Sally Walton. Her great-grandparents and then her grandfather, Sam Jr., was also recorded. But on the reverse side of that same card was information about Sam and Sally's parents. Here was additional information about his mother, his father, and her father. She also found an interview with her great-grandmother and great-grandfather about their life in the Choctaw Nation. She found out that Samuel Walton was originally born in Arkansas and had later been sold as a slave to someone in the Choctaw Nation. She realized that there was entire records reflecting people who had been slaves of Choctaw Indians, many of whom had Choctaw blood, an entire record set of African people that had never been talked about. Angela Walton Raji stated the freed African men and women that had integrated into the Native American tribes had been deleted from American history. For freed men of Oklahoma, there is a microfilm publication of the National Archives that consists of freed men enrollment cards for individuals who had been enslaved or their parents had been enslaved by citizens of the 5 civilized tribes. Those individuals were eligible to receive land allotment. Data was collected on each person who was applying for land, usually the head of the household, about where they lived and who their slave owner was. These interviews took place in the 1890s. And slavery within the territories officially ended in 1866. The reverse side of the enrollment card is the name of the person's parents, the father's tribal enrollment, the name of the father's slave owner, if the father had been enslaved, and in many cases, particularly in the Choctaw Nation and Chickasaw Nation, you'll find that the father was actually an Indian. Then there's an interview packet that contains hundreds of reels of microfilm of the actual interviews. These interviews gave the Dawes Commission information to decide whether or not a family should get a land allotment. Land was held in common by the tribes, and freedmen were members of the tribe after 1866 because they didn't have anywhere else to go, and that was their home since the 1830s, so they remained where they were. They spoke the language, they were members of the tribe, they took on the culture. For all intents and purposes, they were fully fledged members of that tribe. But Oklahoma statehood was approaching, and before the rest of the land could be released for white settlers to come in, the United States government decided to take the land that was held in common by the tribes and redistribute it to the individual members. Angela Walton Raji was asked if her great-grandmother had told her if she was born into slavery or even African. Angela's response was, no, she didn't. She had no memory of it. She was born into the tribe, and that was all she knew. She wasn't aware of the consequences that resulted in her being in the tribe. I hope this will clear up some of the confusion. There are a lot of links in the description, and these videos will go into a lot more depth. The links address the Aboriginal aspect, the Ivan Van Sertima theory, Pangea, Lucia, the slave ships and slave numbers, grandmothers and enrollment cards, as well as how Africa got its name, and much, much more. Angel Ramirez Jordan. Peace, love, and coconut oil. Make sure you follow me on Instagram and Twitter at angel_IKYG. If you like the video, make sure to share and definitely don't forget to subscribe. Click that bell so that you always get notifications whenever I post a video and you never miss an update. Also, check out my website, www.ikyg.com. Check out any projects that I might have going on, coaching sessions, Angel's thoughts, Angel's videos, any events that might be happening. Make sure to utilize the Black Money section of the website. Advertise your business absolutely free to people that look like you, free forever. And as always, all the links will be in the description. Peace, love, and coconut oil.